clay tablet sits in a museum right now, and it describes the Great Flood before a single drop of water appears. Not rain, not rivers rising, not storm clouds gathering over the plains of Mesopotamia. Something else entirely. A disturbance, a gathering, a decision made somewhere above the world the scribes who wrote this could see with their own eyes. Scholars have been reading this text for over a century. Most call it mythology, a poetic framing device used by an ancient culture to give narrative weight to a natural disaster. And that is the mainstream position, and it is well supported, and it deserves to be stated clearly at the start. But read the oldest surviving layer of the flood tradition literally, not the later, more polished Babylonian versions, not the Gilgamesh tablet most people have heard of, but the earliest Sumerian fragments recovered from the ruins of Nippur. And something in the sequence breaks from what any simple weather story would require. The oldest flood account on Earth does not begin on Earth. It begins with a council, a decision, and only then, water. What that sequence means, whether it encodes something real or simply reflects how an ancient culture chose to narrate its gods and its disasters, is a question this documentary will not pretend to resolve. But it is a question worth asking honestly, which is exactly what this documentary intends to do. Before we go further, if this kind of historical and archaeological exploration is what you are here for, subscribe now. Every week, this channel examines texts, tablets, and interpretive debates at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The discovery at Nippur. What is real and documented? In the late 19th century, archaeologists working at Nippur in what is now southern Iraq uncovered thousands of clay tablets beneath the ruins of one of Sumer's oldest cities. The excavation was led by the University of Pennsylvania, one of the first American expeditions to work systematically in Mesopotamia. The haul was staggering. Tens of thousands of fragments pulled from mounds that had sat undisturbed for millennia. This is all verified, documented, and not in dispute. Nippur was not a political capital in the ordinary sense. Within the Sumerian religious world, it was understood as the seat of the god Enlil and the place where the gods themselves were believed to convene. Among the fragments recovered, there was a text that would eventually become known as the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest written accounts of a great flood ever recovered from the ancient world. The Eridu Genesis is a real, authenticated document held in multiple museum collections, translated and retranslated across more than a century of peer-reviewed Assyriological scholarship. It is damaged. Large sections are missing, broken away by thousands of years underground and centuries of disturbance before excavation. Translators still disagree on certain lines. Some gaps may never be filled, but enough survives to establish something genuinely remarkable. Long before the biblical flood narrative existed in any form, the Sumerians had already committed to clay a story of divine anger, a chosen survivor, a vessel, and a flood that erased almost everything. Mainstream scholars understand this text as a likely predecessor, transmitted through Babylonian and Assyrian intermediaries, to the later flood traditions that appear in other ancient Near Eastern and eventually biblical literature. This relationship is documented in peer-reviewed comparative textual scholarship and is not a fringe claim. The Sumerian King List. The flood as a hinge point alongside the flood fragments from Nippur sits another text, recovered in more complete form from a later source, the Sumerian King List, the most complete copy of which is preserved on a four-sided clay prism known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The King List is a real, authenticated, extensively studied document. On its surface, it reads like an administrative record, a chronology of rulers and reign lengths stretching back into the deep past. Then the pattern breaks. The reigns recorded before a certain point stretch into tens of thousands of years, numbers so large they cannot be reconciled with any known chronology or human lifespan. Then, without ceremony, the text states plainly that the flood swept over the land, and that kingship descended from heaven a second time. After that line, the reign lengths collapse into something resembling ordinary human timeframes. Mainstream Assyriology has debated this division for over a century, without reaching full consensus on what those impossible pre-flood rain lengths were actually meant to represent. The dominant scholarly view treats them as mythological or symbolic, a literary device distinguishing a primordial age from historical time, not a literal claim about human longevity. What is not in dispute? The king list uses the flood as a hard boundary, a hinge point separating one kind of world from another entirely. Before it, a world the text itself seems to acknowledge as almost unrecognizable. After it, kingship re-established but changed, brought down to something closer to what the scribes themselves lived in. Whatever the flood represented to the people who wrote this down, it was not simply a disaster among many others in the historical record. It was the moment from which everything afterward was counted, the sequence that does not behave like a weather event. Here is where the reading that has generated the most scholarly and alternative research attention begins. The earliest Sumerian flood fragments, older than the later Akkadian versions, older than the Gilgamesh tablet, preserve a sequence that early translators noticed and never fully settled into consensus about. Arno Pobel, working through fragments of the king list in the early 20th century, and later Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the most respected Sumerologists of the modern era, both encountered phrasing in the flood material that did not behave the way a simple weather event's description would be expected to. The language surrounding the flood's origin does not describe storm clouds gathering or rivers rising in the distance. It describes something happening first among the gods, in a location the texts consistently associate with the heavens, above, before any water is mentioned in the text at all. The sequence that survives in the Nippur fragments, fragmentary as it is, places counsel before water and decision before catastrophe. Mainstream Assyriology reads this as standard narrative structure. The gods conferring in council the way any royal court might, using the cosmological geography of the Sumerian universe as a literary framework rather than a literal physical location. That reading is well supported, grounded in decades of careful comparative textual work, and is the default scholarly position for good reason. What some researchers, most working outside mainstream Assyriology, and this should be stated clearly, have asked is whether that sequence deserves a harder look, not as confirmation of any specific theory, but as a genuine textual feature that the poetic metaphor explanation accounts for only partially. This is a minority position. It is not an emerging consensus. It is a question the oldest surviving layer of the tradition raises and does not answer. The Sumerian cosmological framework. What it actually was to understand why the location matters in this discussion, it helps to understand what the Sumerians actually meant by the heavens, because it was not what a modern reader would picture. The Sumerians organized their universe into 3 layers. An was the sky and heavens, the domain of the highest divine authority in the entire pantheon, the source from which legitimate rule was said to descend to human kings. Ki was the earth, the ordinary realm of mortals, cities, rivers, and daily life. Between and beneath them sat the Abzu, the primeval freshwater deep, the domain of the god Enki, understood as the source of knowledge, creation, and formative power before anything on the surface existed. This 3-part structure was not decorative. It was the operating logic of Sumerian cosmology, and it appears constantly across their literature. Gods move between these realms with clear purpose. Decisions made in An have consequences in Ki. The Abzu is where Enki works, schemes, and occasionally intervenes to protect humanity from decisions made above him. When the tablets describe a council convening before the flood, they are not describing a vague, undefined gathering. They are describing an assembly inside a specific, structured cosmological architecture that the Sumerians understood in careful and consistent detail. Whether that architecture was understood as literal physical geography or as a theological and literary framework is exactly the question mainstream Assyriology and alternative researchers disagree on. The Atrahasis, what the more complete version says. The fragments from Nippur are too damaged to preserve the full content of the council's deliberation. The more complete picture comes from the Atrahasis epic, a real, authenticated Babylonian text dated to approximately 1700 BCE, held in the British Museum, and extensively studied in peer-reviewed scholarship. The Atrahasis states the cause of the flood in terms that are blunt, explicit, and, when read against the heavens disturbed language from the older Nippur fragments, surprisingly mundane, humanity multiplied, humanity made noise. The noise disturbed Enlil's rest. Enlil, increasingly irritated by the clamor rising from the cities below, brought the matter before the full assembly of the gods, demanding something more permanent than the plagues and famines he had already tried and failed with. The vote moved toward destruction, a flood, total and final, meant to erase every trace of what started it all. One god did not comply. Enki, bound by an oath not to warn any human being directly, found a way around the letter of that oath without breaking it. He did not speak to a man. He spoke to a reed wall, knowing that a man named Atrahasis slept on the other side of it and would overhear everything. Through the wall, Enki instructed him to tear down his house and build a boat, to abandon his possessions and save life instead of things, to seal the vessel completely and wait for what was coming. The instructions that follow are strikingly specific. Exact dimensions, particular materials, detailed provisions listed almost like an inventory. Here the text presents a genuine tension worth sitting with honestly. The heavens disturbed language from Nippur places the flood's origin above. The Atrahasis places it in an almost domestic grievance. Noise. These are not obviously the same cause described in different vocabularies. They may be two layers of the same tradition, folded together over generations of scribal transmission, or they may reflect something the available evidence cannot currently resolve. Mainstream comparative mythology acknowledges this kind of layering as common in long-transmitted ancient traditions. Neither layer can be straightforwardly dismissed or straightforwardly confirmed. The flood narrative. Where the three traditions converge, the flood itself, across the Eridu Genesis fragments, the Atrahasis, and the later Gilgamesh tablet, converges into something close to a single coherent account, despite having been composed and copied across centuries in two different languages. The storm lasts 7 days and 7 nights, an interval that recurs so consistently across the versions it functions almost as a fixed formula. The boat rides out the destruction while everything outside is erased. When the waters recede, the survivor releases birds to search for dry land. First a dove, then a swallow, then a raven that does not return. The survivor makes an offering. The gods, described in the Gilgamesh version as starving after days without human offerings, gather around the smell of it. Enlil arrives furious to discover that someone survived his unanimous decision. Enki, no longer bound by secrecy, defends his intervention openly, arguing that destroying all of humanity indiscriminately was never proportionate to noise, and that other solutions always existed. Enlil relents. The survivor and his wife are granted a status set apart from ordinary humanity. The story closes with an uneasy, unresolved peace. This is the authentic content of these texts. It is worth knowing accurately, without embellishment and without reduction. The cross-cultural pattern. What it does and does not establish flood traditions recur across an unusually wide range of unrelated cultures. The Hebrew flood account describes windows of heaven opening alongside the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep, language that echoes the Sumerian An and Abzu structure. Flood narratives from cultures with no plausible contact with Mesopotamia, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands to ancient China, describe a great destruction by water, sometimes preceded by disturbance in the sky. Mainstream comparative mythology explains this through the shared human experience of catastrophic regional flooding. Common and severe enough across early river-based agricultural societies to produce structurally similar stories independently. That explanation accounts for a great deal and remains the default most responsible reading. It does not fully explain why so many otherwise unrelated traditions specifically place the flood's origin above rather than in rising rivers or the sea, which would be the more obvious explanation for societies built on floodplains. This is a genuine observation within the comparative literature. It is not a settled finding, and it does not by itself support any particular alternative interpretation. The geological evidence, real science, active debate. Here, the documentary enters territory where genuine science intersects with the questions raised by ancient texts, and where the distinction between verified findings and contested hypotheses must be stated clearly. Sediment cores collected from multiple sites across the Middle East, Europe, the Americas, and Africa do contain a distinct chemical and physical layer corresponding to approximately 12,900 years ago. This layer includes microscopic glass spherules formed when rock is heated to extreme temperatures very rapidly. The presence of this layer across more than 50 sites on multiple continents is a real and documented finding, published in peer-reviewed geological and geochemical journals. This evidence is central to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the proposal that a cosmic impact or airburst event approximately 12,900 years ago triggered the Younger Dryas, a rapid and severe cooling period during which temperatures dropped significantly within a century, glaciers advanced, and major ecosystem changes occurred across multiple continents. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a real, active, and contested scientific debate. It has supporters with peer-reviewed publications. It also has serious critics who dispute the interpretation of the spheral layer and the proposed mechanism. The scientific community has not reached consensus on whether a cosmic impact caused the Younger Dryas. This is an open question within geology and planetary science, not a settled conclusion in either direction. The Younger Dryas cooling event itself is real and not in dispute. Its cause is what remains debated. The proposed connection between this geological event and the Sumerian flood tradition rests on a chronological alignment that is itself contested. The dating methods involved carry real margins of error on both sides. Mainstream Assyriology notes that the flood traditions as preserved in the cuneiform record are far more recent in their scribal composition than the geological period in question, making the chain of transmission required for such a preserved memory very long and very difficult to verify. What is established and what is not? It is worth pausing to state clearly what this documentary can and cannot confirm. What is independently verifiable, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis Epic, the Sumerian King List, and the Gilgamesh Flood Tablet are all real, authenticated ancient documents held in major museum collections and extensively studied in peer-reviewed scholarship. The Nippur excavations are real and well documented. The Sumerian cosmological framework of An, Ki, and Abzu is real and consistently documented across the authenticated textual record. The Younger Dryas cooling event is real. The spheral layer at the proposed dating boundary is a real geological finding. The cross-cultural pattern of flood traditions with celestial elements is a real documented feature of comparative mythology. What has not been independently verified or reached scholarly consensus, that the heavens-disturbed language in the oldest Sumerian flood fragments encodes a literal memory of a celestial event rather than a literary and theological framing device. That the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is the correct explanation for the spheral layer. That the chronological alignment between the geological evidence and the Sumerian flood tradition is close enough to be meaningful rather than coincidental. What mainstream scholarship establishes differently from alternative interpretations. The Council Before Flood sequence is read as standard divine narrative convention. The impossible pre-flood rain lengths are read as mythological time, not literal longevity. The cross-cultural flood parallels are read as convergent human responses to regional flooding, not as shared memory of a single global event. What is worth holding onto? The Sumerians did not write the flood as a simple weather event. They wrote it as the outcome of a decision made somewhere they called the heavens, arrived at by beings they did not consider human. Before a single description of rain or rising water appears at any point in the oldest surviving account. That sequence is in the text. It has been there since the tablets were first translated. It is not a recent alternative discovery. It is a feature of the oldest layer of the tradition that careful scholars have noted, debated, and not fully resolved. Whether it encodes a literal memory of something observed in the sky, or whether it reflects how a Bronze Age culture narrated its gods and its disasters using the only vocabulary available to them, is a question the tablets, damaged, incomplete, partially lost, do not answer for us. They only ask it. And they ask it across 6,000 years of silence with a patience that the questions themselves, examined honestly, deserve.